What happens when a group of men sit in a lavish European hall, sip tea, and divide up a continent they've never walked? In 1884, the Berlin Conference began, not with a bang, but with long speeches, polished maps, and quiet intentions dressed in silk. No blood was spilled in that room, but the world would never be the same. Tonight, let's drift gently through velvet chairs and gilded walls where empires whispered over Africa's fate.
You'll hear the pens scratch, not swords clash.
You'll feel the weight of decisions that shaped borders while drifting deeper into rest. If you prefer history that lulls you to sleep instead of keeping you awake, subscribe now and hit the bell. Each week, we dim the lights on dusty moments from the past, gently and quietly, so you can rest while learning. The winter of 1884 settled over Berlin like a heavy wool blanket, draping the city in grey mist and persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into every stone and brick of the German capital. Inside the grand residence on Wilhelmstrasse, where Chancellor Otto von Bismarck maintained his official quarters, servants moved quietly through marble corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs as they prepared for what would become one of history's most consequential gatherings. The conference room itself, with its high ceiling adorned with ornate frescoes depicting Germanic legends, had been meticulously arranged according to Bismarck's precise specifications. 14 mahogany chairs, each bearing the embossed crest of its respective nation, formed a perfect circle around an enormous oak table that had been polished until it reflected the gaslight fixtures like a dark mirror. You might wonder why a gathering of diplomats in a room thousands of miles from Africa would matter so profoundly to the millions of people who lived on that continent, who would never set foot in this chamber, who would never see these faces that contemplated their futures with such casual detachment. The answer lies not in any single moment of decision, but in the slow accumulation of choices made over countless breakfasts and evening brandies, in the exchange of letters and telegrams that had crossed Europe for months preceding this gathering, in the private conversations held in drawing rooms and hunting lodges where men of influence determined the fate of nations they had never visited. Bismarck himself, a man whose reputation for diplomatic cunning had earned him the nickname the Iron Chancellor, approached this conference with characteristic pragmatism. At 69 years of age, his massive frame filled the doorway as he surveyed the preparations, his steel blue eyes taking in every detail, from the arrangement of documents to the placement of water carafes. He had not called this meeting out of any particular concern for Africa or its inhabitants. Indeed, like most Europeans of his generation, he viewed the continent primarily as a chessboard upon which the great powers might test their strategic skills without risking the kind of continental warfare that had devastated Europe in previous centuries. Rather, his motivations stemmed from a complex web of European concerns: the need to manage rising tensions between France and Britain, the desire to prevent Germany's diplomatic isolation, and perhaps most importantly, the pressing requirement to establish clear rules for colonial expansion that would prevent the kind of international incidents that could spiral into full-scale war. The invitations had gone out in September, delivered by special messenger to each of the 13 nations whose interests Bismarck deemed significant enough to warrant inclusion. The United States, though it possessed no African colonies, received an invitation partly as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy and partly because American commercial interests in Liberia and along the West African coast had become significant enough to warrant acknowledgement. The European powers, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France,
Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands,
Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and Turkey each sent their most experienced diplomats, men who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of international relations and who understood that the true purpose of such gatherings often lay hidden beneath layers of diplomatic protocol and carefully worded communiques. As the delegates began arriving in Berlin throughout November, The city took on a peculiar atmosphere of expectation mixed with routine. Shopkeepers along Unter den Linden noticed the increased presence of foreign visitors, their distinctive uniforms and diplomatic carriages creating a colourful parade that contrasted sharply with the drab winter landscape. Hotels filled with valets and secretaries, translators and attachés, each playing their part in the elaborate theatre of international diplomacy. The Hotel Kaiserhof, where many delegates stayed, became a hive of activity as couriers arrived daily with dispatches from London, Paris, Lisbon and Rome, each message adding another layer of complexity to the negotiations that would soon begin. The first hints of what would become the conference's most controversial aspect, the complete exclusion of African voices, emerged even before the official proceedings commenced. When the Portuguese delegation raised the question of whether any African representatives might be consulted, the suggestion was dismissed with barely concealed impatience. Sir Edward Mallet, the British ambassador, who would prove to be one of the conference's most influential figures, expressed what many delegates felt when he remarked that African participation would serve only to complicate matters unnecessarily. After all, the purpose of the conference was not to understand Africa or its peoples, but to establish a framework that would allow European powers to expand their influence without coming into conflict with one another. This perspective, shared by virtually every delegate present, reflected deeper attitudes that had taken root over centuries of European engagement with Africa. The continent had long been viewed through the lens of commerce rather than sovereignty, its inhabitants categorized by racial theories that placed them somewhere between children and savages in the European hierarchy of civilization. These assumptions, so casually accepted by the men who gathered in Berlin, would prove far more consequential than any of the specific provisions they would eventually adopt. They represented an entire worldview that saw Africa not as a continent of diverse nations and cultures, but as a blank canvas upon which European ambitions might be painted without regard for existing patterns of settlement, trade or governance. The opening session on November 15, 1884, proceeded with the kind of ceremonial formality that such occasions demanded. Bismarck, acting as conference president, welcomed each delegate in turn, his heavy accent giving the proceedings a distinctly German character that some participants found reassuring and others vaguely unsettling. The French delegation, led by the experienced diplomat Alphonse de Courcelles, maintained an air of studied elegance that contrasted with the more practical approach favoured by the British representatives. The Portuguese, whose colonial interests in Africa stretched back centuries, positioned themselves as veteran authorities on African affairs, though their actual knowledge of the interior regions remained remarkably limited. As the delegates took their assigned seats, each man carried with him not just the weight of his nation's expectations, but also the accumulated prejudices and assumptions of his culture and class. They represented nations that had spent the better part of the 19th century industrializing, building empires, and developing increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for extracting wealth from distant lands. They had come to Berlin not to question these systems, but to refine them, to create rules that would allow for orderly expansion without the kind of destructive competition that might threaten the delicate balance of European peace. The conference room itself seemed designed to inspire contemplation of weighty matters, its tall windows filtering the weak November sunlight through heavy velvet curtains, casting everything in an amber glow that made the passage of time feel less urgent than it actually was. Maps covered every available wall surface, each one depicting Africa as a continent of possibilities rather than peoples, its interior regions marked with bold lines and bright colors that bore little resemblance to the complex realities on the ground. These cartographic representations, created by European geographers who had never visited most of the territories they depicted, would become the primary reference points for decisions that would affect millions of lives across an entire continent. The first days of discussion revealed the fundamental tensions that would define the entire conference. France and Britain, the two powers with the most extensive African holdings, approached the negotiations from positions of established strength, seeking to protect their existing interests while keeping open avenues for further expansion. Germany, newly unified and eager to claim its place among the imperial powers, wanted clear rules that would allow it to compete effectively with more established colonial nations. Portugal clung to ancient treaties and papal bulls that supposedly granted it vast territories it had never actually controlled, while Belgium's King Leopold II pursued his personal ambitions in the Congo with a single-minded determination that would eventually make him one of history's most notorious. The second week of December 1884 brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of the Berlin conference room, as if the weight of their deliberations had finally begun to press upon the delegates with an almost physical force. The initial pleasantries and ceremonial formalities had given way to extended sessions that stretched from morning until late afternoon, punctuated by brief breaks during which the participants would retreat to smaller chambers to continue their discussions in more intimate settings. The gaslights, which had seemed merely atmospheric during the opening sessions, now burned with an intensity that matched the growing seriousness of the negotiations, casting long shadows across the maps that covered the walls, like windows into an alternate reality where Africa existed primarily as a collection of resources and strategic advantages. You find yourself considering the peculiar nature of these proceedings, where men who had never ventured beyond the coastal settlements of Africa, who had never witnessed the complexity of its societies, the sophistication of its trading networks, or the depth of its cultural traditions, proceeded to draw lines across maps with the same casual confidence they might exhibit when dividing a parcel of land for agricultural development. The maps themselves told a story of systematic ignorance, their interior spaces filled with speculative mountain ranges and hypothetical river systems, their borders drawn with straight lines that bore no relationship to the actual geography of the continent they purported to represent. These cartographic fictions, created by European geographers working from second-hand accounts and fragmentary observations, would become the foundation for political boundaries that persist to this day. The question of effective occupation emerged as perhaps the most contentious issue facing the conference, revealing the fundamental philosophical differences that separated the various European approaches to colonial expansion. The German delegation, led by the methodical Baron von Bülow, argued strenuously for a strict interpretation that would require any power-claiming African territory to demonstrate actual administrative control, including the establishment of local governments, the presence of military or police forces, and the signing of treaties with indigenous rulers. This position, which reflected Germany's relatively late entry into the colonial scramble, aimed to prevent more established powers from simply claiming vast territories on the basis of historical precedents or diplomatic agreements that bore little relationship to actual control on the ground. The British approach, articulated with characteristic subtlety by Sir Edward Mallet, reflected a more pragmatic understanding of colonial administration that had been refined through decades of experience in India and other parts of the empire. Britain's vast territorial claims in Africa, stretching from Egypt in the north to the Cape Colony in the south, would have been impossible to administer under the strict German interpretation of effective occupation. Instead, Mallet argued for a more flexible standard that would recognize various forms of influence, including commercial relationships, missionary activities, and informal agreements with local leaders. The British position revealed a deeper understanding of the practical challenges of colonial administration, acknowledging that the kind of comprehensive control envisioned by the Germans would require resources and commitments that most European powers were unwilling to make. France, represented by the aristocratic Alphonse de Courcelles, found itself navigating between these two positions, seeking to protect its existing interests in West and Equatorial Africa while maintaining flexibility for future expansion. The French colonial experience in Algeria and Indochina had taught them that formal administrative control often proved less valuable than commercial influence and cultural penetration, lessons they were reluctant to abandon in favor of the German model. The French delegation also harbored concerns about the potential precedent that might be established by the Berlin Conference, worrying that strict rules governing African colonization might eventually be applied to other parts of the world where French interests were more established. The Portuguese position reflected the peculiar anxieties of a nation
whose imperial glory had faded centuries earlier, but whose diplomatic
traditions maintained the fiction of continuing importance. Portugal's claims to vast territories in Angola and Mozambique rested primarily on 15th-century papal bulls and treaties with Spain that bore little relationship to the actual exercise of authority in Africa. The Portuguese delegation, acutely aware of their weak position relative to the other major powers, sought to preserve as much of their historical claims as possible while avoiding any decisions that might undermine their diplomatic standing. Their arguments often referenced ancient documents and historical precedents that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the practical questions facing the conference. The discussions regarding free trade and navigation revealed another layer of complexity that would have profound implications for Africa's economic development. The principle of free trade, which most delegates supported in theory, encountered practical challenges when applied to the diverse economic interests represented at the conference. Britain's merchant marine, the largest in the world, stood to benefit significantly from unrestricted access to African rivers and markets, while other nations worried that their own commercial interests might be overwhelmed by British competition. The French delegation, in particular, struggled to reconcile their support for free trade principles with their desire to protect French commercial interests in regions where they possessed significant influence. Belgium's position, unique among the participating nations, reflected the personal ambitions of King Leopold II, whose International Association of the Congo had already established a significant presence in the Congo Basin. The Belgian delegation, technically representing a constitutional monarchy but actually serving the interests of their king's private colonial venture, sought recognition of Leopold's claims while avoiding any constraints that might limit his authority over the vast territories he sought to control. The other delegates, most of whom harbored suspicions about Leopold's true intentions, found themselves negotiating with representatives of what amounted to a private corporation that claimed sovereign rights over African territory. The American presence at the conference added another dimension to the proceedings, though the United States delegation, led by the experienced diplomat John Casson, maintained a relatively low profile throughout most of the negotiations. American interests in Africa centered primarily on commercial opportunities and the protection of missionaries rather than territorial acquisition, but the United States had significant investments in Liberia and maintained trading relationships with various African kingdoms that could be affected by European colonial expansion. The American delegation also represented a different philosophical approach to international relations, one that emphasized commerce over conquest and that viewed colonialism with a degree of skepticism that contrasted sharply with European enthusiasm for territorial expansion. The question of slavery and the slave trade, which had been mentioned in Bismarck's original invitation, proved to be one of the more complicated issues facing the conference. While all the delegates publicly supported the abolition of slavery in principle, their commitment to this principle varied significantly when it conflicted with other interests. The British delegation, which had invested enormous resources in suppressing the transatlantic slave trade, advocated for strong measures to prevent the continuation of slavery in Africa. But their position was complicated by their own use of forced labors in other parts of their empire. The French, whose colonial territories in Africa included societies where slavery remained an established institution, sought to avoid any commitments that might interfere with their administrative practices. Perhaps the most significant discussions, though they received relatively little attention at the time, concerned the establishment of spheres of influence that would govern future European expansion in Africa. The concept of spheres of influence, which had been developed in other contexts, represented an attempt to prevent conflicts between European powers by establishing clear boundaries between their respective areas of interest. However, the application of this concept to Africa required the delegates to make assumptions about African societies and their capacity for independent action that revealed the fundamentally colonial nature of their enterprise. By establishing spheres of influence, the conference essentially divided Africa into zones where European powers could act without consulting either African leaders or other European nations, creating a framework for expansion that prioritized European interests over African sovereignty. The negotiations over the Congo Free State, which occupied a disproportionate amount of the conference's attention, illustrated many of these tensions in concrete form. Leopold II's International Association had already established a significant presence in the Congo Basin, but its status remained unclear under international law. The association's representatives claimed that their activities represented a humanitarian mission aimed at ending slavery and promoting civilization. But other delegates harbored doubts about these lofty declarations. The British and French delegations, in particular, worried that recognizing Leopold's claims might create a precedent for other private organizations to establish sovereign rights over African territory, potentially complicating their own colonial ambitions. The conference's approach to the Congo question revealed the extent to which European assumptions about African society influenced their decision-making. The delegates debated whether African rulers possessed the authority to sign treaties transferring sovereignty, whether African societies could be considered sovereign states under international law, and whether European powers had any obligation to consider African interests when making decisions about African territory. These discussions, which took place without any African participation, established precedents that would shape European colonial policy for decades to come. The assumption that African sovereignty was limited or non-existent became embedded in the conference's deliberations, justifying the division of the continent among European powers without reference to African consent or consultation. As December gave way to January, the conference entered its most intensive phase, with delegates working through modified versions of the General Act that would eventually formalize their decisions. The document, which would become one of the most significant agreements in African history, represented a compromise between competing European interests rather than a coherent vision for Africa's future. Its provisions regarding effective occupation, free trade, and the suppression of slavery created a framework for colonial expansion that prioritized European stability over African development, establishing rules that would prove far more durable than any of the delegates could have imagined. The personal dynamics among the delegates added another layer of complexity to these already intricate negotiations. Bismarck's health, which had been declining for several years, occasionally forced him to miss sessions, leaving the conference without the strong leadership that had characterized its early meetings. The personal rivalries between various diplomats, some of whom had known each other for decades, occasionally surfaced in ways that affected the negotiations. The French and British delegates, representing nations that had been rivals for centuries, approached each issue with a degree of mutual suspicion that sometimes hindered cooperation on matters where their interests might otherwise have aligned. The winter deepened, and with it came the realization that the decisions being made in this room would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of European diplomacy. The delegates, most of whom were men in their 50s and 60s, had spent their entire careers navigating the complexities of European power politics, but they were creating precedents that would affect parts of the world they had never seen, and peoples they would never meet. The casual manner in which they divided Africa, drawing borders and establishing spheres of influence with little consideration for African realities, reflected not just their ignorance but their fundamental assumption that European interests naturally took precedence over African concerns. The question that lingered over these proceedings, though none of the delegates seemed willing to acknowledge it directly, concerned the ultimate purpose of their enterprise. Were they creating a framework for the orderly development of Africa, or were they simply institutionalizing a new form of exploitation that would serve European interests at African expense? The language of their discussions, filled with references to civilization, commerce, and humanitarian concerns, suggested the former, but the practical implications of their decisions pointed toward the latter. The establishment of spheres of influence, the recognition of effective occupation, and the validation of Leopold's Congo enterprise all seemed designed to facilitate European expansion rather than African development. As the conference moved toward its conclusion, the delegates faced the task of transforming their various agreements into a coherent document that would govern European expansion in Africa. The General Act of the Berlin Conference, which would become the formal expression of their deliberations, represented a compromise between competing European interests rather than a unified vision for Africa's future. Its 38 articles addressed everything from freedom of navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers to the suppression of slavery, from the principles of effective occupation to the establishment of neutral zones where European competition would be suspended. The document's complexity reflected the diverse interests it was designed to accommodate, but it also revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the European approach to Africa. The attempt to impose order on a continent they did not understand through rules they had created without African participation. The morning of February 26, 1885, dawned cold and clear over Berlin, the kind of crisp winter day that makes the city's architecture seem sharper, more permanent, as if the very buildings understood their role in documenting history. Inside the conference room on Wilhelmstrasse, the delegates gathered for the final session that would formally conclude their 3-month deliberation, each man carrying the accumulated fatigue of negotiations that had stretched longer than any of them had anticipated. The General Act of the Berlin Conference lay before them on the oak table, its 38 articles representing the distilled essence of European ambition, compromise, and casual disregard for African sovereignty that would define the colonial era. You observe these men as they prepared to sign their names to a document that would reshape not just a continent, but the fundamental nature of global power. Bismarck, his health visibly declining, but his authority still unmistakable, presided over the ceremony with the kind of ponderous dignity that had made him one of Europe's most respected statesmen. The French delegation maintained their characteristic composure, though experienced observers might have noticed the slight tightening around Alphonse de Courcelles' eyes as he contemplated the implications of what they were about to ratify. The British representatives, confident in their nation's naval supremacy and commercial advantages, approached the signing with the calm assurance of those who believed they had secured their primary objectives. The ceremony itself proceeded with the kind of formal precision that characterized European diplomacy of the period, each delegate approaching the table in turn to add his signature to the document that would become known as the General Act of the Berlin Conference. The act declared the Congo River Basin neutral and open to free trade, established principles for effective occupation of African territories, created frameworks for notifying other powers of new colonial claims, and committed signatories to suppressing slavery and the slave trade. These provisions, presented in the neutral language of international law,
masked the revolutionary nature of what had been accomplished.
the formal division of an entire continent among European powers without consulting any of the millions of people whose lives would be fundamentally altered by these decisions. The immediate consequences of the conference became apparent within weeks of its conclusion, as European powers accelerated their African expansion with renewed determination. The pace of territorial claims, which had been increasing throughout the early 1880s, reached feverish proportions as colonial administrators rushed to establish the effective occupation required by the conference's provisions. Military expeditions pushed inland from coastal settlements, their officers carrying treaties printed in European languages that African leaders were expected to sign with marks made in ink derived from Ujo manufacturing. These documents, which would later be cited as evidence of legitimate territorial transfer, often bore little resemblance to the agreements their African signatories believed they were making. In the Congo Free State, King Leopold II's private enterprise received the international recognition that would enable one of history's most brutal colonial regimes. The territory, roughly 75 times larger than Belgium itself, became effectively the personal property of a monarch whose previous experience of governance had been limited to a constitutional monarchy where his powers were carefully constrained by parliamentary oversight. The rubber and ivory extracted from the Congo would generate enormous wealth for Leopold personally, while the indigenous population endured forced labor, systematic violence, and population decline that contemporary estimates suggest claimed between 1 and 15 million lives. The humanitarian language embedded in the General Act, which spoke of improving the lives of native inhabitants, provided a veneer of legitimacy that masked the economic exploitation that drove colonial expansion throughout Africa. The British Empire, already the world's largest colonial power, used the Berlin Framework to consolidate its holdings across the continent. The occupation of Egypt, justified initially as a temporary response to financial crisis and civil unrest, became permanent under the new rules that recognized effective occupation as the basis for territorial claims. British administrators pushed south from Egypt into Sudan, west from the Cape Colony into the interior of southern Africa, and north from coastal settlements in West Africa toward the Sahara. Each advance was carefully documented and communicated to other European powers according to the notification procedures established in Berlin, creating a veneer of international legitimacy for what amounted to military conquest. French colonial expansion followed similar patterns, as the government in Paris authorized military campaigns to establish effective occupation of territories that had previously existed as spheres of influence or commercial relationships. The conquest of territories in West Africa proceeded through a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure, with African rulers confronted by choices that offered little genuine autonomy. Treaties signed under duress became the legal foundation for French authority, while resistance movements faced military suppression that established the effective control required by Berlin's provisions. The French presence in North Africa expanded through similar means, with Algeria, Tunisia, and eventually Morocco falling under French influence or direct control. The Portuguese, whose diplomatic position had been weak throughout the conference, found themselves struggling to maintain effective occupation of territories they had claimed for centuries but never actually controlled. The establishment of administrative presence in Angola and Mozambique required resources that strained Portugal's limited capacity, forcing the government to rely increasingly on private companies and foreign investment to maintain the facade of colonial authority. These arrangements, while satisfying the letter of the Berlin requirements, created dependencies that would shape Portuguese colonial policy for decades to come. The Italian and German colonial enterprises, which had been largely theoretical before 1885, gained international legitimacy through the Berlin Framework, though both nations would struggle to establish effective control over their African territories. German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, and German Cameroon became colonial possessions that required enormous investments of military and administrative resources to maintain, contributing to the expansion of German military capacity that would play a significant role in the tensions that led to World War I. Italian efforts to establish colonies in Eritrea and Somalia followed similar patterns, with the Berlin provisions providing legal justification for military campaigns that encountered sustained African resistance. The long-term consequences of the Berlin Conference extended far beyond the immediate territorial divisions it authorized. The borders established through European negotiation, without reference to African geography, culture, or existing political arrangements, created the foundation for many of the political conflicts that would plague Africa throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The straight lines that appeared on European maps divided ethnic groups, separated trading partners, and created artificial nations that encompassed peoples with no shared history or common identity. These arbitrary boundaries, drawn in European conference rooms by men who had never visited the territories they were dividing, became the borders of modern African states. Their artificiality creating challenges for governance that persist more than a century later. The economic implications of the Berlin Framework proved equally profound, as the principle of free trade and navigation established in the General Act created conditions that facilitated European commercial penetration of Africa while limiting the ability of African societies to control their own economic development. The opening of the Congo and Niger rivers to international commerce, while presented as a humanitarian measure that would promote African prosperity, primarily served European commercial interests by providing access to African resources and markets. The economic relationships established under Berlin's provisions typically involve the extraction of raw materials for European manufacturing and the importation of European manufactured goods, creating trade patterns that would perpetuate African economic dependence. The social and cultural consequences of the conference, though less immediately visible than its political and economic effects, proved equally significant. The European assumption that African societies lacked the capacity for legitimate sovereignty, embedded in the conference's proceedings, justified colonial policies that undermined traditional authority structures and imposed European administrative systems. The creation of colonial educational systems that emphasized European languages and values while devaluing African knowledge and traditions contributed to cultural disruption that would affect African societies for generations. The racial theories that underpinned European colonialism reflected in the casual dismissal of African participation in decisions about African territory, established patterns of discrimination that would persist beyond the formal end of colonial rule. The environmental impact of colonial expansion authorized by the Berlin Conference also proved significant, as European commercial interests gained access to African natural resources on terms that prioritized extraction over conservation. The rubber extraction that generated enormous wealth for Leopold II in the Congo also resulted in widespread deforestation and environmental degradation that affected local ecosystems. Similar patterns developed throughout colonial Africa as European companies gained access to timber, minerals, and agricultural land without bearing the full environmental costs of their activities. The long-term consequences of this resource extraction continue to affect African environmental conditions today. Perhaps most significantly, the Berlin Conference established precedents for international relations that extended far beyond Africa. The idea that powerful nations could gather to divide the world among themselves without consulting the peoples whose territories were being allocated created a model for international behavior that would be repeated in other contexts. The assumption that European interests naturally took precedence over non-European concerns reflected a worldview that would influence global power relationships throughout the colonial period and beyond. The legal frameworks established at Berlin, which prioritized European concepts of sovereignty and property over African systems of authority and relationship to land, became templates for colonial law that would be applied across multiple continents. As you reflect on these events from the perspective of more than a century later, the casual manner in which these decisions were made seems almost incomprehensible in its disregard for African agency and its assumption that European concerns naturally took precedence over all others. Yet the delegates who signed the General Act genuinely believed they were creating frameworks that would bring order to international relations and promote the development of territories they viewed as backward and chaotic. Their inability to recognize the legitimacy of African sovereignty reflected not just individual prejudice, but an entire worldview that saw European civilization as the natural endpoint of historical development. The Berlin Conference did not cause the scramble for Africa, which had been accelerating throughout the early 1880s, but it provided the diplomatic framework that made systematic colonial expansion possible while preventing the kind of European conflicts that might have checked the process. The rules established in Berlin created conditions that allowed colonialism to proceed more efficiently and with less international friction, accelerating the pace of European expansion while limiting opportunities for African resistance. The Quito Conference's decisions affected not just the territories that became European colonies, but also the independent African states that found themselves surrounded by European-controlled territories and subject to European influence. The question that remains is whether any of this could have happened differently, whether the forces of European expansion that had been building throughout the 19th century could have been channeled in directions that might have left more room for African development and autonomy. The delegates who gathered in Berlin represented nations that had been transformed by industrialization and that were seeking resources and markets to fuel continued economic growth. Their assumptions about European superiority and African backwardness were so deeply embedded in their worldview that alternative approaches may have been literally unthinkable. Yet the speed with which colonial expansion proceeded after 1885 and the systematic nature of the exploitation that followed suggest that the Berlin Conference accelerated processes that might otherwise have developed more slowly and perhaps with greater attention to African interests. The lines drawn in Berlin remain visible today in the borders of modern African states, in the economic relationships that link Africa to Europe, and in the political challenges that confront African nations as they work to overcome colonialism's legacy. The assumption that African development should follow European models, that African resources should serve European interests, and that African sovereignty should be limited by European concerns continues to influence international relationships in ways that extend far beyond the specific territories that became European colonies. The Berlin Conference stands as a monument to the casual exercise of power, to the ability of a small group of men to make decisions that would affect millions of lives without ever considering those whose futures they were determining. The delegates, who signed the General Act, returned to their respective capitals, confident that they had accomplished something significant, that they had brought order to international relations and established principles that would govern European expansion in ways that promoted peace and prevented conflict. They could not have imagined that their decisions would still shape African political geography more than a century later, or that the borders they established would become sources of conflict that would persist into the 21st century. Their inability to see beyond the immediate concerns of European diplomacy, to recognize the humanity of the peoples whose territories they were dividing, represents not just a failure of imagination, but a failure of moral vision that would have consequences far beyond what any of them could have anticipated. The morning mist that settled over the royal palace in Brussels on that particular October day in 1885 carried with it the crisp promise of autumn. But for King Leopold II of Belgium, the changing seasons seemed merely a backdrop to his own triumph. At 50 years of age, the monarch had spent the better part of 2 decades pursuing a vision that his contemporaries found alternately inspiring and disturbing, depending on their perspective and proximity to his ambition. The documents that lay before him on an ornate mahogany desk, their seals freshly broken and their contents still bearing the faint scent of African sand that had somehow clung to them through their journey from the Congo, represented the realization of that vision. Recognition by the major European powers that the Congo Free State, an entity covering approximately 2.3 million square kilometers, belonged not to Belgium but to Leopold personally. You might find yourself wondering what kind of man could look upon a map showing territory 75 times larger than his own kingdom and see not the lives of millions of people, but rather the possibilities for personal enrichment. The answer lies not in any single characteristic, but in the peculiar combination of qualities that defined Leopold, a constitutional monarch in Europe who chafed against the constraints of parliamentary democracy, a businessman who understood the potential of African resources at a time when European industrialization created unprecedented demand for raw materials, and a ruler whose genuine belief in his own civilizing mission masked an extraordinary capacity for self-deception about the consequences of his actions. His contemporaries described him as intelligent, methodical, and utterly convinced of his right to rule, qualities that, when combined with European assumptions about African inferiority, created a framework for exploitation that would prove devastating in its efficiency. Leopold's path to personal colonial empire had begun not with grand visions, but with what seemed a relatively modest interest in African exploration. In 1876, he had convened the Geographic Conference of Brussels, bringing together European explorers and scientists to discuss the continent's mysteries under the guise of scientific inquiry and humanitarian concern. The International African Association that emerged from this gathering presented itself as a philanthropic organization dedicated to ending slavery and promoting civilization, objectives that aligned perfectly with contemporary European attitudes toward Africa. However, even in these early stages, Leopold's private correspondence revealed a more calculating approach, with references to the commercial possibilities of African territories and the potential for Belgian influence in regions previously dominated by British and French interests. The transformation of philanthropic interest into personal ownership required careful navigation of European diplomatic waters, a process that revealed Leopold's considerable skills as a strategist and his willingness to operate in the shadows of international politics. His approach relied heavily on intermediaries, particularly the Welsh-born American journalist Henry Morton Stanley, whose exploration of the Congo River basin provided the geographical knowledge necessary for establishing European claims in the region. Stanley's expeditions, funded secretly by Leopold through a complex web of financial arrangements, charted the Congo River system and established trading posts that would later serve as the administrative centers of Leopold's private state. The explorers' reports, which emphasized the region's commercial potential while downplaying the complexity of its societies, provided the geographical foundation for Leopold's territorial claims. The legal framework that transformed Leopold's commercial interests into sovereign authority required even more subtle maneuvering, as European international law offered few precedents for private individuals claiming ownership of entire countries. Leopold's approach involved the creation of what amounted to a shell organization, the International Association of the Congo, which presented itself as a humanitarian enterprise while actually serving as the legal vehicle for his personal ambitions. The association's charter, drafted by Belgian lawyers with expertise in international commerce, created structures that appeared to serve African interests while actually concentrating power in Leopold's hands. This arrangement allowed Leopold to claim that his activities in Africa represented a civilizing mission rather than personal enrichment, a distinction that proved crucial in gaining European acceptance of his claims. The negotiation of treaties with African leaders, which Stanley conducted on Leopold's behalf between 1879 and 1884, represented perhaps the most cynical aspect of the entire enterprise. These documents, written in European languages and employing legal concepts completely foreign to African societies, purported to transfer sovereignty over vast territories in exchange for promises of protection and commercial benefits that would prove largely illusory. The treaties typically established Leopold's association as the legitimate authority in regions covering thousands of square kilometers, often based on agreements with local leaders whose actual authority was far more limited than the documents suggested. The signing ceremonies, which Stanley documented extensively through photographs and written accounts, created the appearance of legitimate territorial transfer while actually serving as the legal foundation for what amounted to a massive land grab. The African leaders who signed these documents, when they could be said to have signed them at all, operated under circumstances that made genuine consent virtually impossible. Many believed they were entering into commercial agreements rather than surrendering sovereignty, while others signed under pressure created by Stanley's expeditions, which typically included well-armed escorts whose military capabilities far exceeded those available to local societies. The language barriers that separated European and African negotiators created additional opportunities for misunderstanding, while the cultural differences regarding concepts of land ownership, political authority, and international relations made it unlikely that African leaders fully understood the implications of what they were signing. Yet these documents, whatever their actual meaning to the parties involved, provided the legal foundation for European recognition of Leopold's claims at the Berlin Conference. The financial arrangements that supported Leopold's African venture revealed the extent to which his interest in the Congo was driven by commercial rather than humanitarian considerations. The king invested personal funds amounting to millions of francs in Stanley's expeditions, the establishment of trading posts, and the administrative infrastructure necessary to support European claims in the region. These investments, which represented a significant portion of Leopold's personal wealth, were structured as loans to the International Association rather than charitable contributions, suggesting that Leopold expected financial returns that would justify his initial expenditures. The association's financial records, which became public after Leopold's death, revealed a sophisticated understanding of African commercial possibilities, with detailed projections of rubber production,
Ivory exports and mineral resources that seemed
far removed from the humanitarian rhetoric that characterized Leopold's public statements about his African interests. The transformation of Leopold's commercial enterprise into a recognized sovereign entity required not just European diplomatic acceptance, but the creation of administrative
structures that could plausibly claim to govern
the vast territories claimed by the International Association. The Congo Free State, as Leopold's African possession became known, required bureaucracies, military forces, and judicial systems that could maintain order and collect revenue while projecting an image of legitimate government to international observers. Leopold's approach to this challenge involved hiring administrators from throughout Europe, often men whose experience in colonial administration had been gained in British India or the Dutch East Indies, creating a management structure that combined European bureaucratic practices with the authoritarian characteristics that would later characterize the regime's most brutal
aspects. The judicial system
established by Leopold's administration reflected the fundamental contradiction between the Free State's humanitarian pretensions and its actual function as a vehicle for resource extraction. The courts, staffed primarily by European judges who possessed little understanding of African legal traditions or social structures, operated according to Belgian law as modified by local ordinances that increasingly served Leopold's commercial interests. The legal framework created categories of offenders whose crimes, ranging from failure to meet rubber quotas to resistance against European authority, carried penalties that included forced labor, corporal punishment, and imprisonment under conditions that would later shock international observers. These judicial practices, which became increasingly severe as Leopold's regime sought to maximize revenue from African resources, established patterns of state violence that would characterize the entire period of European colonial rule. The military forces that maintained Leopold's authority in the Congo represented another aspect of administration that revealed the gulf between the regime's public image and its actual operations. The Force Publique, as the Congo Free State's military was known, initially consisted of African soldiers led by European officers, but its composition and behavior evolved in ways that reflected the increasingly extractive nature of Leopold's rule. The army's primary function became the enforcement of rubber collection quotas and the suppression of resistance to European authority, roles that required systematic violence against African populations. The military courts established to maintain discipline among African soldiers created parallel legal structures that operated without the procedural protections that characterized European judicial systems. While the extensive powers granted to military commanders created opportunities for abuse that would contribute to the international criticism that eventually forced Leopold to surrender his African possession, the infrastructure development that occurred under Leopold's rule, while presented as evidence of the civilizing mission that justified European intervention in Africa, actually served primarily to facilitate the extraction of resources that generated revenue for the Congo Free State's sovereign. The construction of roads, railways, and river transport systems connected African production centers to coastal ports, but these developments generally served Leopold's commercial interests rather than African needs. The railway from Matadi to Leopoldville, which required enormous investments of capital and African labor, provided access to the Upper Congo River system, but also enabled the efficient transport of rubber and ivory to European markets. Similar patterns characterized other infrastructure projects, which typically served European commercial interests while providing limited benefits to African populations, whose labor made such development possible. The question that emerges from this examination of Leopold's
African venture concerns not just the
details of his exploitation, but the broader implications of a system that allowed a single individual to claim ownership of territory larger than most European nations. The European diplomatic recognition of Leopold's claims, granted through the Berlin Conference and subsequent bilateral agreements, established precedents for colonial rule that extended far beyond the Congo Free State itself. The assumption that African sovereignty could be transferred through treaties signed under duress, that European commercial interests justified the establishment of authoritarian rule, and that African resources existed primarily to serve European needs became embedded in colonial practice throughout Africa. The personal nature of Leopold's rule also revealed aspects of colonialism that might have remained hidden under more conventional administrative arrangements. Because the Congo Free State existed primarily to enrich its sovereign rather than to serve broader national interests, the exploitation of African resources, and labor proceeded with a directness and intensity that might have been moderated by political considerations in a colony that answered to public opinion or parliamentary oversight. The rubber extraction system that generated enormous wealth for Leopold while causing widespread African suffering represented colonialism in perhaps its purest form, stripped of the administrative pretensions and civilizing rhetoric that characterized most European colonial ventures. As you consider the implications of Leopold's personal kingdom, the question arises of how such an arrangement could have been accepted by contemporary European opinion, which generally viewed itself as committed to principles of justice and human dignity. The answer lies partly in the racial assumptions that characterized European thought during this period, which made it difficult for most Europeans to extend to Africans the same considerations they would have demanded for themselves. The belief that African societies represented earlier stages of human development, combined with genuine ignorance about African political institutions and cultural achievements, created a framework in which European intervention could be presented as beneficial rather than exploitative. The Congo Free State also illustrated the extent to which European assumptions about private property and commercial development shaped their approach to Africa. Leopold's regime treated African territory and resources as commodities that could be owned, traded, and exploited according to European commercial principles, ignoring systems of land tenure and resource management that had developed over centuries of African experience. The transformation of communal African lands into private property, whether owned by the state or by European companies, represented a fundamental change in
African social relationships that would have consequences
extending far beyond the colonial period itself. The story of Leopold's personal kingdom reveals not just the character of one man's ambition, but the systemic nature of European colonialism and the ways in which individual greed could operate within broader imperial frameworks. The diplomatic recognition that transformed Leopold's commercial venture into a sovereign state represented European complicity in a system that prioritized European interests over African welfare, while the profitability of the Congo Free State demonstrated the enormous wealth that could be extracted from African resources through systematic exploitation. The eventual international criticism that forced Leopold to surrender control of the Congo came too late to prevent the human and environmental damage that had been done, but it also revealed the extent to which European opinion could be mobilized to challenge colonial practices when they became sufficiently notorious to threaten the moral legitimacy of imperial expansion itself, the legacy of Leopold's personal rule, extended far beyond the specific territories that comprised the Congo Free State, influencing colonial practice throughout Africa and establishing patterns of resource extraction and labor exploitation that would characterize European colonialism for decades to come. The assumption that African resources existed primarily to serve European needs, that African labor could be compelled through systematic violence, and that African societies could be fundamentally restructured according to European preferences, became embedded in colonial administrative practice. The borders established through Leopold's treaties with African leaders, whatever their actual meaning to the parties involved, provided the foundation for the national boundaries that would shape African political development throughout the 20th century. The question that remains is whether the international community's eventual rejection of Leopold's regime represented a genuine challenge to colonialism itself, or merely a refinement of its methods to make exploitation more palatable to European public opinion. The rising sun on a typical morning in the Congo Free State during the late 1880s revealed a landscape that had been fundamentally transformed by the daily rhythms of resource extraction, though the full extent of this transformation would have been difficult for casual observers to appreciate. The forest canopy that stretched endlessly across the horizon appeared unchanged from time immemorial, its green vastness suggesting a natural world that operated according to patterns established long before European arrival. Yet beneath this apparent permanence, a sophisticated system of exploitation had been established that linked African villages to European markets through networks of coercion, transportation, and economic exchange that would have been unimaginable to the region's inhabitants just 2 decades earlier. The machinery of extraction that Leopold's regime had created represented perhaps the most efficient system for converting human suffering into private wealth that had ever been established. Its operations conducted with a bureaucratic precision that masked the extraordinary brutality of its underlying methods. The rubber collection system that became the foundation of Leopold's Congo enterprise operated according to principles that had been refined through years of experimentation. Its procedures documented in detailed reports sent regularly to Brussels, where the king personally reviewed the accounts of his African possession. Each village within the rubber-producing regions of the Congo was assigned a quota based on estimates of local rubber vine density. These calculations, performed by European agents who possessed little understanding of the ecological relationships that determined rubber production or the social organization that governed African labor allocation. The quotas, which increased steadily throughout the 1890s as European demand for rubber grew and Leopold's financial appetite expanded, bore no relationship to sustainable harvesting practices or the actual needs of African communities whose labor was being compelled. A village might be required to deliver 40 kilograms of rubber per month, a quantity that required adult men to spend weeks in the forest collecting latex from wild vines, leaving agricultural work, family responsibilities, and community obligations neglected. The collection process itself involved methods that had been developed through trial and error to maximize production while minimizing European supervision, an approach that reflected both the limited number of European personnel available to administer the vast territory and the regime's assumption that African labor required compulsion rather than incentives. Village chiefs, whose authority had been co-opted through a combination of threats and rewards, received monthly instructions specifying the quantity of rubber required from their communities. These demands communicated through messengers who traveled by foot along forest paths that connected scattered settlements throughout the rubber-producing regions. The chiefs bore responsibility for ensuring that quotas were met, a burden that created impossible choices between satisfying European demands and maintaining community solidarity, between preserving their own positions and protecting their people from the consequences of non-compliance. The transportation networks that moved rubber from African forests to European markets represented a remarkable feat of engineering and human organization. though their construction and operation required systematic violence that would become notorious when details of Congo administration eventually reached international audiences. The system began with individual collectors who carried rubber from interior forests to village collection points, journeys that might require several days of walking through terrain that European observers found impassable, but that Africans navigated with practiced ease. These local carriers, who received no payment for their labor beyond the implicit promise that meeting quotas would spare their communities from more severe punishment, formed the base of a pyramid that extended through
regional collection centers to river
ports where steamboats operated by the Congo Free State transported bulk rubber to coastal export facilities. River transport system, which represented one of Leopold's most significant infrastructure investments, connected the interior regions of the Congo Basin to the Atlantic port of Boma through a network of steamboats and storage facilities that enabled efficient bulk transport of rubber and other export commodities. The steamers themselves, manufactured in Europe and transported to Africa in pieces that were assembled at Leopoldville, operated according to schedules that prioritized European commercial interests over African transportation needs. The boats carried not just rubber, but also the agents and soldiers who enforced collection quotas, creating a circular system in which export commodities and administrative authority reinforced each other through transportation, networks that became increasingly essential to regional economic life while serving primarily European interests. The administrative bureaucracy that managed these operations expanded steadily throughout the 1890s as the Congo Free State developed government structures that combined European bureaucratic practices with authoritarian characteristics that would have been impossible to maintain in European societies. The district commissioners who oversaw rubber collection possessed extraordinary powers over African populations within their jurisdictions, including authority to impose forced labor, levy fines, and administer punishments ranging from corporal punishment to imprisonment in facilities whose conditions would later shock international investigators. These administrators, who typically received salaries supplemented by bonuses tied to rubber production levels in their districts, operated with minimal oversight from higher authority, creating opportunities for abuse that would contribute to the international criticism that eventually forced Leopold to surrender control of the Congo. The system of accountability that theoretically governed Congo administration actually served to
reinforce rather than constrain the
extraction of African resources and labor, as the reporting requirements established by Leopold's government focused primarily on production levels and revenue generation rather than African welfare or sustainable development. District commissioners submitted monthly reports detailing rubber collections, ivory exports, and tax revenues, these documents forming the basis for statistical compilations that allowed Leopold to track the profitability of his African possession while maintaining the appearance of systematic administration. The reports rarely mentioned African living conditions, community disruption, or environmental consequences of rubber collection, focusing instead on the efficiency with which European demands were being satisfied through African labor. The role of African intermediaries within this system proved essential to its operation, though the individuals who occupied these positions faced impossible choices between collaboration and resistance, between personal survival and community protection. The village chiefs who enforced rubber quotas, the armed guards who supervised collection, and the interpreters who facilitated communication between European administrators and African populations all became complicit in a system whose brutality they could not control but whose operation they were required to support. The rewards available to collaborators, which might include exemption from forced labor, access to European goods, and protection from arbitrary punishment, created incentives that undermined traditional authority structures while providing insufficient benefits to justify the community disruption that collaboration necessitated. The environmental consequences of systematic rubber extraction proceeded according to patterns that became apparent only gradually, as the removal of wild rubber vines from forest ecosystems disrupted relationships between plant and animal species that had evolved over centuries of African experience. The rubber collection methods employed by Leopold's regime, which involved cutting vines and collecting latex in ways that killed the plants, proved unsustainable even by European standards of resource management, though the short-term profitability of these methods masked their long-term environmental implications. The deforestation that accompanied road construction and settlement expansion created additional ecological pressures, while the concentration of population around European administrative centers disrupted traditional agricultural practices that had maintained soil, fertility and food security for generations. The resistance movements that emerged in response to these extraction systems revealed both the brutality of European rule and the limitations of African opposition to systematic exploitation. As the military superiority enjoyed by Leopold's forces made organized rebellion extraordinarily costly, while the geographic dispersal of African communities made coordinated resistance practically impossible. The rebellion led by African soldiers in the Force Publique during 1895 demonstrated the extent to which even those Africans who had been incorporated into European administrative structures maintained loyalties that transcended their collaborationist roles, while the scattered uprisings that occurred throughout the rubber-producing regions illustrated the difficulty of sustaining opposition to a regime that possessed overwhelming military advantages and sophisticated intelligence networks. The international scrutiny that eventually brought these operations to public attention emerged through channels that Leopold had not anticipated, as missionaries, commercial competitors, and humanitarian reformers gradually assembled evidence of Congo administration practices that contradicted the civilizing rhetoric used to justify European intervention in Africa. The reports compiled by British Consul Roger Casement, detailing systematic violence, population decline, and economic exploitation that appeared to serve primarily Leopold's personal enrichment, created diplomatic pressure that eventually forced the Belgian government to assume responsibility for Congo administration. These investigations, which began as commercial disputes between European trading companies, eventually revealed the extent to which the rubber extraction system had been built on systematic coercion, whose brutality shocked even experienced colonial administrators. The transition from Leopold's personal rule to Belgian colonial administration, completed in 1908, represented not so much an end to the exploitation of African resources as a refinement of its methods to make extraction more acceptable to international opinion, while maintaining the profitability that had made the Congo venture attractive to European investors. The administrative structures established during Leopold's reign, though modified to reduce the most flagrant abuses, remained fundamentally oriented toward resource extraction rather than African development, while the transportation networks and collection systems created to serve European commercial interests continued to shape African economic life in ways that reinforced colonial dependency. As you examine the machinery of extraction that Leopold created, the question arises of how such a system could have been sustained for more than 2 decades before international pressure forced its modification, and what this delay reveals about European attitudes toward African welfare during the colonial period. The profitability of the Congo Free State, which generated enormous wealth for Leopold personally while contributing significantly to Belgian national income, created constituencies within Europe that benefited from continued exploitation while remaining insulated from its human costs. The complexity of the administrative system, which obscured responsibility for individual decisions within layers of bureaucracy that extended from African villages to European capitals, made it difficult for critics to identify specific villains beyond Leopold himself, while the racial assumptions that characterized European attitudes toward Africa made it unlikely that
African suffering would generate sustained moral outrage among European publics. The legacy of this extraction system extended
far beyond the specific territories that comprised the Congo Free State, establishing precedents for colonial administration and resource exploitation that would influence European policy throughout Africa. The assumption that African labor required compulsion that African resources existed primarily to serve European needs, and that African societies could be fundamentally restructured according to European preferences became embedded in colonial administrative practice, while the transportation networks and collection systems created to serve Leopold's commercial interests provided the foundation for later colonial development. The question that remains is whether the international criticism that eventually forced modification of Congo administration represented a genuine challenge to colonial exploitation, or merely a refinement of its methods. To make resource extraction more acceptable to European public opinion while maintaining its essential characteristics of systematic African disadvantage. The ledgers that arrived monthly at the Royal Palace in Brussels during the final years of Leopold's reign told a story of extraordinary profitability. That would have been the envy of any 19th century industrialist, though the accounting methods employed by the Congo Free State obscured as much as they revealed about the true costs of maintaining a personal colonial empire. The columns of figures meticulously recorded by European administrators in specially bound books, whose pages bore watermarks indicating their official status, documented rubber collections measured in kilograms, ivory exports tallied by weight and quality, and tax revenues calculated down to the smallest fraction of a franc. Yet these same ledgers, which provided Leopold with the satisfaction of watching his African investment generate returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections, contained no entries for the human costs that made these profits possible, no line items for villages destroyed during rubber collection campaigns, for populations displaced by European administrative requirements, or for the environmental degradation that accompanied systematic resource extraction. The accounting of empire as practiced by the Congo Free State measured success exclusively through European categories of profit and loss while remaining blind to African experiences of colonial rule. The financial returns that made Leopold's African venture so personally rewarding emerged through systems that had been refined over 2 decades of operation, their efficiency improving steadily as administrators learned to extract maximum value from African labor and resources while minimizing European investment in infrastructure or social services. The rubber profits alone, which reached their peak during the mid-1890s when international demand for automobile tires created unprecedented markets for Central African latex, generated annual revenues that exceeded the entire budget of the Belgian government during the same period. These funds, which flowed directly into Leopold's personal accounts rather than Belgian state coffers, provided the financial foundation for the king's elaborate building projects in Brussels, his acquisition of properties throughout Europe, and the establishment of foundations whose charitable activities burnished his reputation while obscuring the sources of his wealth. The cost structure that generated these extraordinary profits relied fundamentally on the systematic undervaluation of African labor and resources, an approach that required not just economic exploitation, but the complete restructuring of African societies to serve European commercial interests. The wages paid to African workers, when they received any payment at all, bore no relationship to the market value of their labor or the profits generated by their activities, while the prices established for African commodities reflected European commercial needs rather than African costs of production. The result was a transfer pricing system that allowed Leopold's administration to report impressive profits while externalizing most of the real costs of colonial production onto African populations whose suffering appeared nowhere in official financial statements. The international banking networks that facilitated these transfers revealed the extent to which European financial institutions became complicit in colonial exploitation, as established banks in London, Paris, and Antwerp provided the services necessary to convert African resources into European wealth while asking few questions about the methods through which these conversions occurred. The Banque d'Outre-mer, which handled many of the Congo Free State's international transactions, developed specialized expertise in managing colonial accounts that enabled European investors to profit from African exploitation while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial activity. These banking relationships, which continued even after international criticism of Congo administration became widespread, demonstrated the resilience of financial networks that served European interests while remaining largely indifferent to African welfare. The investment patterns that characterized Leopold's Congo administration reflected priorities that emphasized resource extraction over African development, creating infrastructure that served European commercial needs while providing limited benefits to African populations whose labor made such development possible. The railway construction that connected the interior regions of the Congo Basin to coastal export facilities required enormous capital investments, but these expenditures were justified by transportation cost savings that increased the profitability of rubber and ivory exports while doing little to improve African living standards or economic opportunities. Similar priorities characterized other infrastructure projects, which typically served European commercial interests, while providing minimal benefits to African communities whose resources funded such development. The labor accounting that governed African participation in colonial economic systems operated according to principles that treated human beings as variable costs rather than as individuals possessing rights or dignity, creating administrative categories that obscured the human reality of forced labor systems while enabling officials to report impressive economic efficiency statistics. The working hours extracted from African populations, which often exceeded European labor standards of the period, generated value for European investors while providing no corresponding improvement in African living conditions, while the productivity measurements established by colonial administrators focused exclusively on European commercial benefits rather than African welfare considerations. These accounting practices, which became standard throughout colonial Africa, established precedents for labor exploitation that would influence European colonial policy for decades to come. The environmental accounting that might have revealed the long-term costs of systematic resource extraction remained almost entirely absent from official financial records, as the depletion of wild rubber vines, the deforestation that accompanied road construction, and the disruption of traditional agricultural systems appeared nowhere in calculations of profit and loss that determined colonial administrative priorities. The assumption that African natural resources existed in unlimited supply, combined with the European belief that environmental modification represented progress rather than degradation, created frameworks for resource exploitation that prioritized immediate profitability over long-term sustainability. These environmental costs, though invisible to contemporary accountants, would affect African development possibilities for generations after Leopold's personal rule had ended. The population accounting that might have documented the human consequences of colonial exploitation remained similarly obscure, as the demographic decline that occurred throughout the rubber-producing regions of the Congo appeared nowhere in official reports that focused instead on production levels and revenue generation. The mortality rates that resulted from forced labor, malnutrition, disease transmission accelerated by colonial administrative requirements, and systematic violence against resistant communities represented costs that were borne entirely by African populations while generating no corresponding entries in European financial records. The result was an accounting system that reported impressive profits while remaining completely blind to the human suffering that made such profitability possible. The international scrutiny that eventually forced modification of these practices emerged through investigations that revealed the extent to which European accounting systems had failed to capture the true costs of colonial exploitation, as British consul Roger Casement's detailed reports documented not just individual instances of abuse but systematic patterns of extraction whose profitability depended fundamentally on the externalization of costs onto African populations. The calculations prepared by humanitarian reformers, which attempted to quantify both the economic value extracted from the Congo and the human costs of such extraction, demonstrated that conventional accounting methods provided fundamentally misleading pictures of colonial economic relationships by ignoring categories of cost that became visible only when examined from African perspectives. The transition from Leopold's personal rule to Belgian colonial administration, completed in 1908, represented an attempt to address some of these accounting failures by incorporating social welfare considerations into official financial reporting, though the fundamental structure of colonial economic relationships remained oriented toward European benefit rather than African development. The budgets prepared by Belgian colonial authorities included expenditures for education, healthcare, and infrastructure development that had been absent from Leopold's priorities, but these investments remained modest compared to resource extraction activities, while serving primarily to legitimize colonial rule rather than to promote genuine African advancement. The question that emerges from this examination of imperial accounting concerns not just the specific methods employed by Leopold's regime, but the broader implications of economic systems that treat certain categories of cost as invisible, while emphasizing others whose measurement serves primarily to justify continued exploitation. The accounting practices that made the Congo Free State appear profitable would have produced dramatically different results if forced to incorporate the full range of costs generated by colonial exploitation, including not just direct expenditures, but the opportunity costs imposed on African societies whose development possibilities were systematically constrained to serve European commercial interests. The legacy of these accounting methods extended far beyond the specific territories that comprised the Congo Free State, influencing colonial administrative practice throughout Africa, while establishing patterns of economic relationship between Europe and Africa that emphasized European benefit while externalizing costs onto African populations. The assumption that African labor and resources possessed value primarily in relation to European commercial needs became embedded in colonial economic policy, while the infrastructure investments that might have promoted African development proceeded only when they served European interests or provided administrative benefits that justified their costs from colonial perspectives. As you reflect on this accounting of empire, the question arises of whether contemporary international relationships continue to reflect assumptions about cost and benefit that were established during the colonial period, whether the trade relationships that link Africa to Europe and other developed regions still operate according to principles that systematically disadvantage African interests while providing benefits to more powerful partners. The lines that appeared in Leopold's ledgers representing profits that seemed to materialize from African soil without corresponding costs established patterns of thought about African economic relationships that may persist long after the formal structures of colonial rule have disappeared. The afternoon sun that beat down on the village of Denbigh in North Wales on the January day in 1841, when John Rowlands first entered the world, seemed unremarkable to those who witnessed his birth, though the circumstances of his arrival would prove prophetic of the extraordinary life that lay ahead. Born to a mother whose identity remained shrouded in the kind of mystery that characterized working-class origins in industrializing Britain, the infant, who would later transform himself into Henry Morton Stanley, began his existence among the social margins of a society that measured human worth through family connections, financial stability, and adherence to established social hierarchies. The abandonment that followed his birth, the years spent in a workhouse whose conditions would later inspire some of England's most scathing social criticism, and the early education in survival that characterized his youth might have seemed to prepare him for a life of obscurity rather than for the role he would eventually play in determining the future of an entire continent. You find yourself considering what combination of personal characteristics and historical circumstances could transform a Welsh workhouse boy into the individual whose explorations would provide the geographical knowledge necessary for Europe's division of Africa, whose mapping of the Congo River system would enable claims of sovereignty over territories larger than most European nations, and whose reports of African resources and societies would help justify the colonial exploitation that followed European expansion. The answer lies not in any single moment of transformation, but in the gradual accumulation of experiences that taught Stanley to view the world through The lens of European imperial ambition while maintaining the survival instincts developed during his difficult early years. His capacity for self-reinvention, his willingness to embrace the kind of personal mythology that obscured humble origins, and his extraordinary ability to endure physical hardship, combined with the historical moment when European industrialization created unprecedented demand for African resources and geographical knowledge about Africa's interior. Stanley's transformation from John Rowlands to Henry Morton. Stanley represented more than a simple change of name, though the adoption of his new identity at age 18 marked a crucial moment in his personal development. The identity he constructed drew upon American rather than British traditions, emphasizing the kind of rugged individualism and democratic possibility that seemed unavailable to a poor Welsh youth with no family connections or financial resources. His migration to the United States, which occurred through circumstances that remained the subject of speculation throughout his life, provided access to the kind of opportunities that industrializing America offered to ambitious young men willing to endure hardship and take risks that might have seemed unacceptable to those raised in more stable circumstances. The American Civil War, in which Stanley served on both sides before deserting from both armies, provided his first experience of systematic violence and his introduction to the logistical challenges of moving large numbers of men through hostile territory under difficult conditions. The journalism career that Stanley established upon his return to civilian life revealed his capacity for describing remote places and dramatic events in ways that captured public attention while serving the commercial interests of newspaper publishers who understood that stories about exploration and adventure sold copies and increased circulation. His assignment to cover the British expedition to Abyssinia in 1868 provided his first experience of African travel, though his role as correspondent rather than participant limited his direct engagement with African societies while exposing him to the kind of military campaign that would later characterize his own expeditions. The dispatches he sent from Ethiopia, which emphasized the exotic character of African landscapes and the military prowess of European forces, established the narrative voice that would characterize his later writing about African exploration, vivid, dramatic, and focused on European rather than African perspectives. The discovery of David Livingstone at Ujiji on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in November 1871, the event that transformed Stanley from an obscure journalist into an internationally recognized figure, occurred through circumstances that revealed as much about European attitudes toward Africa as about Stanley's personal capabilities. The expedition that located the missing missionary, funded by the New York Herald and supported by the kind of logistical resources that only wealthy European or American backers could provide, represented the application of industrial-age organizational methods to African exploration, complete with porters hired from coastal communities, supplies purchased from Indian merchants, and weapons manufactured in European factories. Stanley's famous greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" though possibly apocryphal, captured perfectly the kind of formal courtesy that characterized European social relationships even in the most remote African locations, suggesting that European explorers carried with them not just geographical knowledge but social hierarchies and cultural assumptions that shaped their encounters with African societies. The expedition that followed the Livingstone Relief Mission provided Stanley with the experience and geographical knowledge that would prove essential to his later work for Leopold, as he traced the connections between the Great Lakes of Central Africa and the river systems that provided the means for penetrating the continent's interior regions. The mapping activities that occupied much of this period required not just physical endurance, but the kind of observational skills that could transform African geographical knowledge, which had been developed through centuries of local experience, into European cartographic representations that served European rather than African purposes. The latitude and longitude measurements that Stanley collected, the altitude readings that established the relationships between different geographical features, and the distance calculations that linked various African locations created the foundation for European claims of territorial sovereignty based on geographical knowledge that had been assembled without African participation or consent. The geographical knowledge that Stanley accumulated during his African expeditions represented not simply neutral information about African landscapes and river systems, but a particular kind of knowledge that served European rather than African interests, emphasizing connections between African interior regions and European commercial centers, while de-emphasizing the relationships between African communities that had shaped the continent's development for centuries. The maps that Stanley produced, which became essential references for European governments and commercial interests seeking to understand African geographical possibilities, presented Africa as a collection of resources and transportation routes, rather than as a continent of diverse societies with their own histories, cultures, and development trajectories. This geographical knowledge, though based on extensive field observation and remarkable personal courage, reflected European assumptions about African backwardness and European entitlement that would influence colonial policy throughout the continent. The relationships that Stanley established with African communities during his expeditions revealed both his capacity for working across cultural boundaries and the fundamental limitations that characterized European understanding of African societies, as his reports emphasized the exotic and primitive character of African life, while remaining largely blind to the sophistication of African political institutions, economic systems, and cultural achievements. His descriptions of African rulers, which focused on their military capabilities and territorial control rather than on their administrative methods or relationships with their subjects, provided European readers with information that served commercial and colonial interests while doing little to promote understanding of African societies as complex civilizations with their own internal logic and development trajectories. The expedition that traced the Congo River from its headwaters to the Atlantic Ocean, completed between 1874 and 1877, established Stanley's reputation as perhaps the greatest African explorer of his generation, while providing the geographical knowledge that would enable Leopold to claim sovereignty over the vast territories drained by Africa's second-largest river system. The journey required remarkable physical courage and organizational capability as Stanley's party navigated previously uncharted stretches of river, negotiated passage through territories controlled by African societies that possessed their own reasons for permitting or obstructing European travel, and established relationships with local leaders whose cooperation proved essential to the expedition's success. The mapping activities that accompanied this journey, which established the Congo's connections to other African river systems and its potential as a transportation route for commercial penetration of the continent's interior, represented geographical knowledge whose value to European interests would prove impossible to overestimate. The documentation that Stanley produced during his Congo expedition, which included detailed maps, geographical observations, and ethnographic descriptions, created a body of knowledge that would influence European understanding of Central Africa for decades to come. His writings, published in books that became international bestsellers, presented African landscapes and societies to European audiences in language that emphasized the continent's commercial possibilities while reinforcing assumptions about African primitiveness that justified European intervention. The vivid descriptions of African wildlife, the dramatic accounts of encounters with African rulers, and the detailed documentation of geographical features created a narrative that captured public imagination while serving the commercial interests that funded such exploration. The question that emerges from this examination of Stanley's early career concerns not just his personal transformation from workhouse boy to celebrated explorer, but the broader implications of geographical knowledge that served European colonial interests while claiming to represent objective scientific understanding of African reality. The maps that Stanley produced, though based on extensive field observation and remarkable personal courage, presented Africa as Europeans wanted to see it, rather than as it existed for Africans themselves, emphasizing connections to European commercial centers while de-emphasizing relationships between African communities that had shaped the continent's development for centuries. The knowledge that enabled Europe's division of Africa emerged not from neutral scientific investigation, but from exploration whose purposes and methods were shaped by European commercial and political interests that Africans had played no role in defining. The contracts that Stanley signed with King Leopold II during the late 1870s, documents whose careful legal language obscured the extraordinary scope of their implications, represented the transformation of geographical knowledge from scientific pursuit to commercial enterprise as the explorer who had become famous for mapping Africa's interior regions agreed to apply his expertise and reputation to establishing European sovereignty over territories whose size and resources exceeded the domains of most European monarchs. The financial arrangements that underpinned these agreements, which provided Stanley with salaries and bonuses that far exceeded the compensation available from journalism or pure scientific research, created incentives that aligned his personal interests with Leopold's colonial ambitions while establishing precedents for relationships between European explorers and commercial interests that would influence African exploration for decades to come. The explorer who had presented himself as a neutral observer of African geography became instead an agent of European expansion whose activities would directly serve the kind of territorial claims that the Berlin Conference would later legitimize. The expedition that Stanley organized on Leopold's behalf between 1879 and 1884, formally described as a commercial venture aimed at establishing trading relationships with African communities, actually served as the foundation for territorial claims that would eventually cover the entire Congo Basin as the explorer applied the organizational methods he had developed during his earlier journeys to establishing European administrative presence in African territories that had previously existed beyond European control. The construction of trading posts, which Stanley supervised with the same attention to logistical detail that had characterized his mapping expeditions, created permanent European settlements whose presence could be cited as evidence of effective occupation. When European diplomats gathered to formalize their division of African territories, the roads that connected these posts, built through forced labor that Stanley organized with military precision, provided transportation routes that served both immediate commercial needs and long-term administrative requirements for governing territories whose size made European-style administration extraordinarily challenging. The treaty negotiations that Stanley conducted with African leaders during this period represented perhaps the most controversial aspect of his transformation from explorer to colonial agent, as the documents he produced purported to transfer sovereignty over vast territories in exchange for promises of protection and commercial benefits whose fulfillment would prove largely illusory. The treaties themselves, written in European languages and employing legal concepts completely foreign to African societies, established Leopold's association as the legitimate authority in regions covering thousands of square kilometers, often based on agreements with local leaders whose actual authority was far more limited than the documents suggested. The signing ceremonies, which Stanley documented extensively through photographs and written accounts, created the appearance of legitimate territorial transfer while actually serving as the legal foundation for European claims that Africans had played no role in defining. The geographical knowledge that Stanley produced during this period served multiple purposes that extended far beyond the immediate needs of navigation and commerce, as his maps and reports provided the kind of detailed territorial information that enabled European governments to make specific claims about African territories during diplomatic negotiations that occurred without African participation. The boundary lines that appeared on Stanley's maps, though presented as geographical features that reflected natural divisions in African landscapes, actually represented divisions that served European rather than African interests, creating territories whose borders bore little relationship to the complex relationships between African communities that had shaped the continent's political geography for centuries. The knowledge that enabled these territorial claims emerged through exploration whose purposes were defined by European commercial needs rather than African social realities. Yet this geographical information would become the foundation for political boundaries that persist to the present day. The infrastructure development that Stanley supervised during his service to Leopold revealed the extent to which European commercial interests shaped African economic development, as the transportation networks and administrative facilities created through his expeditions served primarily to facilitate resource extraction rather than to promote African prosperity or sovereignty. The road construction that connected interior regions to river ports required enormous investments of African labor, organized through methods that combined European engineering knowledge with African knowledge of local conditions while serving purposes that Africans had played no role in defining. The result was infrastructure development whose benefits flowed primarily to European commercial interests, while providing only incidental advantages to African communities whose resources and labor made such development possible. The relationship between geographical knowledge and commercial exploitation that characterized Stanley's work for Leopold established precedents for European exploration of Africa that would influence colonial policy throughout the continent. As the distinction between scientific investigation and commercial development became increasingly blurred in ways that served European interests while limiting African possibilities for autonomous development. The maps that Stanley produced, though based on extensive field observation and remarkable personal courage, presented Africa as Europeans wanted to see it rather than as it existed for Africans themselves, emphasizing commercial possibilities, while de-emphasizing political complexities that might have complicated European territorial claims. This knowledge, which claimed scientific objectivity while actually serving specific commercial interests, became the foundation for colonial policies that assumed European rather than African priorities should govern the continent's development. The business arrangements that governed Stanley's relationship with Leopold also revealed the extent to which European exploration of Africa had become commercialized during the late 19th century, as the financial incentives available to successful explorers created motivations that aligned personal ambition with European colonial expansion while establishing market values for geographical knowledge that served commercial rather than scientific purposes. Stanley's compensation, which included both regular salaries and bonuses tied to the success of Leopold's territorial claims, created direct financial incentives for producing geographical information that supported European sovereignty rather than African interests. The result was exploration whose methods and purposes were shaped by commercial considerations that Europeans had defined without African participation, yet whose consequences would fundamentally alter African possibilities for self-determination. The international recognition that Stanley's activities helped secure for Leopold's African claims demonstrated the extent to which European exploration had become integrated with diplomatic processes that determined global power relationships, as the geographical knowledge produced by expeditions like Stanley's provided the foundation for territorial claims that European governments were prepared to recognize and defend through diplomatic and military means. The Berlin Conference, which formally acknowledged Leopold's sovereignty over the Congo Free State, relied heavily on maps and reports produced by Stanley's expeditions to establish the specific boundaries and territorial extent of European claims in Africa. The explorer who had begun his career as a journalist seeking to document African geography had become an agent of European expansion whose activities directly served the kind of territorial division that the conference would legitimize. The resistance that Stanley encountered during his efforts to establish European authority in African territories revealed both the effectiveness of his methods and their fundamental limitations, as African communities developed strategies for opposing European expansion that exploited the vulnerabilities inherent in any system based on foreign control of local resources and population. The military campaigns that Stanley organized to suppress resistance to European authority, though successful in the short term, required resources and commitments that revealed the extent to which colonial expansion depended on systematic violence rather than legitimate authority. while the intelligence networks that African communities developed to monitor European activities demonstrated their capacity for coordinated opposition to foreign intrusion. These resistance movements, though ultimately unsuccessful in preventing European expansion, revealed the extent to which colonial authority relied on force rather than consent, creating precedents for African opposition to European rule that would influence anti-colonial movements throughout the colonial period. The transition from exploration to administration that characterized Stanley's later career revealed the broader transformation of European engagement with Africa during the late 19th century. As the geographical knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of exploration became the foundation for administrative systems that served European rather than African interests. The administrative methods that Stanley developed during his service to Leopold, which combined European bureaucratic practices with authoritarian characteristics that would have been impossible to maintain in European societies, established precedents for colonial governance that would influence European policy throughout Africa. The explorer who had become famous for documenting African geography had become an architect of colonial administration whose activities would shape African political development for generations to come. The question that emerges from this examination of Stanley's transformation from explorer to colonial agent concerns not just his personal evolution, but the broader implications of geographical knowledge that claimed objectivity while actually serving specific commercial and political interests. The maps that Stanley produced, though based on extensive field observation and remarkable personal courage, presented Africa as Europeans wanted to see it rather than as it existed for Africans themselves, emphasizing commercial possibilities while de-emphasizing political complexities that might have complicated European territorial claims. The business of geography, as practiced by Stanley and his contemporaries, created knowledge that served European expansion while claiming scientific neutrality, establishing precedents for relationships between academic research and commercial interests that would influence African development for decades to come. The aging Stanley, who returned to London in the early 1890s, his hair turned silver and his face bearing the marks of decades spent in African sun, carried with him not just the physical souvenirs of exploration, the maps, the journals, the artifacts collected from dozens of African societies, but the accumulated weight of knowledge that had helped transform an entire continent's future. The lecture halls where he spoke to enthusiastic audiences, the private drawing rooms where he shared his experiences with wealthy patrons, the government offices where his expertise was sought by colonial administrators all reflected his transformation from obscure journalist to celebrated authority whose geographical knowledge had become essential to Europe's understanding of Africa. Yet the acclaim that surrounded his later years masked a more complex reality. As the explorer who had mapped Africa's interior regions gradually came to understand that the knowledge he had produced served purposes far different from those he had originally envisioned when he first set foot on African soil. The geographical knowledge that Stanley had accumulated during his African expeditions, which had seemed to him initially like neutral scientific information that would advance human understanding of the world's remaining mysteries, had become instead the foundation for political claims whose consequences extended far beyond the commercial interests that had funded his exploration. The maps that bore his name, distributed throughout European capitals and colonial administrative centers, presented Africa as a collection of territories whose boundaries had been determined by European negotiation rather than African history, whose resources existed to serve European needs rather than African development, whose future would be shaped by European rather than African choices. The knowledge that had required extraordinary personal courage and physical endurance to acquire had become a tool for legitimizing arrangements that Africans had played no role in creating. It's the recognition that Stanley received from European governments and academic institutions reflected the extent to which his geographical knowledge had served European rather than African interests. As honorary degrees from prestigious universities, medals from geographical societies, and appointments to colonial advisory committees all acknowledged his contributions to European understanding of Africa, while remaining largely indifferent to the consequences of such knowledge for African societies themselves. The Royal Geographical Society's highest honour, the Patron's Medal, recognized Stanley's mapping achievements without considering whether the geographical knowledge that enabled Europe's division of Africa had actually served the interests of the continent's inhabitants. These accolades, while personally satisfying to a man who had risen from humble origins, represented European approval for activities that Africans had experienced as the preliminary to foreign domination, the testimony that Stanley provided to governmental committees investigating colonial
administration revealed the extent to which his
understanding of Africa had been shaped by European assumptions about African backwardness and European entitlement, as his recommendations for colonial policy emphasized the need for European control over African development while expressing confidence that such intervention would ultimately benefit African populations whose capacity for self-government he viewed with skepticism. His advice to colonial administrators, based on decades of African experience, focused on methods for establishing European authority efficiently while minimizing the costs of maintaining control over resistant populations, suggesting that his geographical knowledge had been complemented by administrative expertise that served European rather than African interests. The explorer who had documented African geography had become an advocate for colonial policies that assumed European rather than African priorities should govern the continent's development. The personal wealth that Stanley accumulated through his exploration and colonial service, while substantial by the standards of his origins, seemed modest compared to the enormous fortunes generated by the colonial enterprises his geographical knowledge had enabled, suggesting that the relationship between knowledge and profit in European expansion involved complex distributions of benefit that favored those who controlled capital over those who produced information. His earnings from book sales, lecture tours, and colonial appointments provided financial security that would have been impossible to achieve through journalism alone. Yet these rewards represented only a fraction of the wealth generated by the territorial claims his exploration had helped legitimize. The geographical knowledge that had required extraordinary personal sacrifice to acquire had become a commodity whose value was realized primarily by European investors and governments,
rather than by the explorer whose
fieldwork had made such knowledge possible. These correspondence that Stanley maintained with African colleagues from his expeditions, though limited by literacy barriers and geographical distance, revealed aspects of his African relationships that his published writings obscured, as his letters acknowledged debts to African guides, interpreters, and local leaders whose knowledge had been essential to European exploration, while
recognizing that such relationships had been fundamentally
altered by the colonial arrangements his geographical knowledge had helped establish. The African companions who had shared the dangers and discoveries of his expeditions found themselves incorporated into colonial administrative systems that provided them with opportunities for advancement within European-dominated hierarchies, while undermining the traditional authority structures that had governed their societies before European expansion. These relationships, though personally meaningful to Stanley, reflected broader transformations in African society that served European
rather than African interests. The
historical assessment of Stanley's contributions to African exploration evolved significantly during the 20th century, as the independence movements that transformed African political geography also altered European understanding of colonial exploration and its consequences. The geographical knowledge that Stanley had produced, once celebrated as evidence of European scientific achievement and civilizing mission, came to be viewed by many scholars as the preliminary to colonial exploitation that Africans had experienced as foreign domination rather than beneficial development. The maps that had established Stanley's reputation as perhaps the greatest African explorer of his generation became evidence of European appropriation of African geographical knowledge for purposes that served European
rather than African interests.
while his descriptions of African societies were reinterpreted as examples of European blindness to African cultural achievements and political sophistication. The personal memoirs that Stanley composed during his later years revealed the extent to which his understanding of his own African experiences had been shaped by European assumptions about exploration and discovery that remained largely unexamined throughout his career, as his reflections on decades of African travel emphasized the heroism and sacrifice required to map unknown territories while remaining largely blind to the ways in which such mapping served colonial purposes that
Africans had played no role in defining.
his conviction that geographical knowledge represented objective scientific achievement, untainted by the political and commercial interests that such knowledge served, reflected European assumptions about the neutrality of academic research that would be challenged by later generations of scholars who recognized the extent to which all knowledge reflects the social context within which it is produced and employed. The explorer who had mapped Africa's geography had been unable to map the political consequences of his own activities. The legacy of Stanley's geographical knowledge extended far beyond his personal reputation or the specific territories he had explored, influencing European understanding of Africa throughout the colonial period while establishing precedents for relationships between academic research and colonial expansion that would affect African development for generations to come. The maps that bore his name became standard references for colonial administrators seeking to understand African geographical possibilities, while his administrative recommendations influenced policies that assumed European rather than African priorities should govern the continent's development. The knowledge that had required extraordinary personal courage to acquire had become institutionalized in ways that served systematic exploitation rather than African advancement, suggesting that the relationship between exploration and development involved complexities that Stanley himself never fully understood. The question that emerges from this examination of Stanley's later career concerns not just his personal failure to recognize the political implications of his geographical work, but the broader responsibility of knowledge producers for the consequences of information that serves purposes beyond their
Immediate control or understanding.
The maps that Stanley produced, though based on extensive field observation and remarkable personal integrity, became tools for legitimizing arrangements that Africans had experienced as foreign domination rather than beneficial development. The weight of knowledge that Stanley carried during his later years represented not just personal achievement, but a European complicity in colonial exploitation that extended far beyond the specific territories his exploration had helped bring under European control. As you consider Stanley's transformation from celebrated explorer to unwitting agent of colonial expansion, the question arises of whether similar patterns might characterize contemporary relationships between academic knowledge and political power, whether the geographical, economic, or social research that claims objective neutrality might actually serve interests that remain hidden from researchers themselves while affecting populations whose participation in defining research purposes has been limited or non-existent. The knowledge that enabled Europe's division of Africa emerged not from
Neutral scientific investigation, but from
exploration whose methods and purposes were shaped by European commercial and political interests that Africans had played no role in defining, yet whose consequences would fundamentally alter African possibilities for self-determination. The letter that Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia composed in the winter of 1889, its elaborate script carefully inscribed on parchment that bore the imperial seal of a kingdom whose history stretched back to biblical times, represented perhaps the most dignified response that any African ruler managed to articulate to the casual dismissal of African sovereignty that characterized the Berlin Conference. Written in Amharic but translated into French for distribution to European capitals, the document that would become known as Menelik's circular letter carried with it not just the formal protests of a sovereign whose territory had been divided among European powers without his knowledge or consent, but the accumulated dignity of an African civilization that had existed for millennia before European nations had even emerged from their medieval fragmentation. The messenger, who carried this letter from the highland capital of Addis Ababa, faced a journey of thousands of miles through territories whose control was increasingly contested by European powers. Yet the importance of his mission transcended the physical difficulties of travel, as he bore with him the response of African sovereignty to the casual assumption that European interests naturally took precedence over African concerns. You find yourself contemplating the extraordinary position that Menelik occupied during the late 1880s, as European powers divided African territories among themselves with the same casual confidence they might exhibit when allocating colonial possessions among business partners. The Ethiopian emperor, whose domain encompassed some of the world's most ancient Christian civilizations, whose diplomatic relationships with European powers extended back to the Roman Empire, and whose military forces had recently demonstrated their capacity to defeat well-equipped European armies, found himself excluded from discussions that would determine the future of territories bordering his own kingdom. The Berlin Conference, whose delegates presumed to establish rules for African development without consulting any African leaders, represented not just diplomatic oversight, but the fundamental European assumption that African sovereignty possessed legitimacy only when it served European interests, that the relationships between African states that had shaped the continent's political geography for centuries could be casually disregarded when they conflicted with European commercial or strategic needs. The kingdom that Menelik ruled in 1889 represented far more than the mountainous territory that European maps depicted as an isolated African state, though the geographical challenges that protected Ethiopian independence had also limited European understanding of the civilization that had developed in the highlands of the Horn of Africa. The Christian kingdom that traced its origins to the conversion of King Ezana in the 4th century had maintained its religious traditions through centuries of conflict with Islamic powers, had developed its own written language and literary traditions, and had created administrative systems that governed diverse populations extending from the Red Sea coast to the Sudanese border. The Solomonic dynasty that Menelik represented claimed descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a genealogy that provided legitimacy rooted in scriptural authority while connecting Ethiopian sovereignty to traditions that predated European nation-states by millennia, military achievements that had brought Menelik to power and secured his authority over the diverse populations that comprised the Ethiopian empire reflected not just personal ambition but the sophisticated understanding of strategy and diplomacy that characterized African statecraft during this period. The campaigns that consolidated his control over regional rivals during the 1880s required coordination of forces that included cavalry whose mobility matched anything available to European armies, infantry whose knowledge of local terrain provided decisive advantages against foreign invaders, and auxiliary forces whose loyalty could be secured through the complex system of client relationships that governed African political life. The artillery that Menelik's forces possessed, purchased from European manufacturers through commercial relationships that African rulers maintained with various European powers, demonstrated the extent to which African states could access European military technology when it served their interests, while the tactical knowledge required to employ these weapons effectively reflected African military sophistication that European observers often underestimated. The diplomatic relationships that Menelik maintained with European governments revealed the extent to which
African rulers understood and could
manipulate European rivalries to serve their own interests, as the Ethiopian emperor played French, British, and Italian interests against each other to maintain Ethiopian independence, while securing access to European technology and expertise that strengthened his domestic position. The Italian connection, which had developed through missionary activities and commercial relationships, provided Menelik with military advisors and weapons that would prove crucial in the conflict that would define his reign, while the British relationship, based on mutual concern about Islamic expansion in the Sudan, gave Ethiopia access to Indian Ocean trade routes that sustained the commercial relationships essential to imperial economy. The French connection, maintained through diplomatic representatives whose presence in Addis Ababa reflected Paris's interest in challenging British influence in the Horn of Africa, provided Menelik with alternatives to British
and Italian support while
demonstrating his understanding of European balance of power politics. The letter that Menelik composed in response to the Berlin Conference's implications for Ethiopian sovereignty represented not just diplomatic protest, but the articulation of an African perspective on international relations that Europeans had largely
ignored in their deliberations about Africa's future.
The document, whose elegant Amharic prose reflected the literary sophistication of Ethiopian court culture, asserted Ethiopian sovereignty in language that drew upon both African traditions of kingship and European concepts of international law that African rulers had studied and adopted to serve their own purposes. The claim that Ethiopia possessed the same rights as European nations to determine its own political relationships, to control access to its territory and resources, and to maintain diplomatic relationships with other sovereign states represented an assertion of African equality that directly challenged European assumptions about African backwardness and European superiority that had underpinned their discussion of African territories. The territorial disputes that emerged following the Berlin Conference revealed the practical implications of European decisions for African states that had been excluded from the diplomatic negotiations that established colonial boundaries, as Italian colonial ambitions in Eritrea brought Ethiopian and European interests into direct conflict in ways that would test both African military capabilities and European assumptions about African political legitimacy. The Treaty of Wuchale, signed in 1889 between Menelik and Italian representatives, represented the kind of diplomatic agreement that African rulers had negotiated with European powers for centuries, yet its provisions revealed the extent to which European colonial ambitions had fundamentally altered the nature of such relationships. The Italian interpretation of the treaty, which claimed that Ethiopia had surrendered its sovereignty to Italian protection, contradicted both the Amharic text that Menelik had approved and the traditional understanding of such agreements as commercial arrangements between sovereign equals. The military preparations that Menelik undertook during the early 1890s reflected his understanding that the diplomatic recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty would require military defense against European powers whose colonial ambitions seemed unlimited by the kind of mutual respect that traditionally governed relationships between African states. The weapons purchases that consumed an increasing portion of imperial revenues demonstrated both Ethiopian access to international arms markets and the recognition that maintaining independence would require matching European military capabilities, rather than relying solely on traditional African military methods. The modernization of Ethiopian forces, which included not just acquisition of European weapons but training in European military tactics and organization, represented an attempt to adapt African statecraft to European standards of military effectiveness, while preserving the indigenous political structures that provided legitimacy for imperial authority. The Battle of Adwa, fought on March 1, 1896, represented the culmination of Menelik's efforts to defend Ethiopian sovereignty through military means, as the Ethiopian army that he personally commanded defeated an Italian colonial force, whose European-style organization and weaponry seemed to guarantee victory according to contemporary European assumptions about military superiority. The victory that Ethiopian forces achieved, which resulted from superior numbers, better knowledge of local terrain, more effective logistics, and the kind of tactical coordination that African military leaders had developed over centuries of statecraft, demonstrated the extent to which European military advantages could be neutralized when African forces possessed comparable weapons and sufficient time to prepare for engagement. The defeat that Italian forces suffered, which represented the most significant European military loss in Africa, since the beginning of colonial expansion, shocked European public opinion while providing African resistance movements with evidence that European armies were not invincible. The international recognition that followed Ethiopian victory at Adwa revealed the extent to which European respect for African sovereignty depended primarily on demonstrated capacity for military resistance, rather than on any recognition of inherent African rights to self-determination or equality under international law. The diplomatic relationships that Menelik established with European powers during the decade following Adwa, which included commercial treaties, military agreements, and cultural exchanges, reflected European acceptance of Ethiopian sovereignty that emerged not from any change in European racial attitudes or colonial ambitions, but from the practical recognition that conquering Ethiopia would require resources and commitments that exceeded the benefits such conquest might provide. The boundaries that European powers eventually accepted for Ethiopian territory, which encompassed the highland regions that had formed the core of the historic Ethiopian state, represented pragmatic compromise rather than genuine acceptance of African equality with European nations. The question that emerges from this examination of Menelik's defiance concerns not just the specific circumstances that enabled Ethiopian independence, but the broader implications of African resistance to European expansion for understanding the possibilities and limitations of African agency during the colonial period. The success that Menelik achieved in maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty, though remarkable in its immediate consequences, depended on factors that were not available to most African societies facing European colonial expansion, including access to European military technology, the geographical protection provided by mountainous terrain, the administrative sophistication developed through centuries of statecraft, and the diplomatic relationships that enabled manipulation of European
Rivalries.
The Ethiopian example, while demonstrating that European colonial expansion could be resisted successfully, revealed the extraordinary resources and circumstances required for such resistance, while establishing precedents for African sovereignty that would influence anti-colonial movements throughout the colonial period. The legacy of Menelik's defiance extended far beyond the specific territories that comprised the Ethiopian Empire, influencing African resistance to colonial rule while establishing precedents for African participation in international relations that would affect the continent's political development throughout the 20th century. The recognition that European powers eventually granted to Ethiopian sovereignty, though based primarily on military rather than moral considerations, provided African nationalists with evidence that European colonialism could be successfully challenged, while demonstrating the kinds of capabilities and resources that such challenges required. The diplomatic relationships that Menelik maintained with European governments, though based on pragmatic compromise rather than genuine acceptance of African equality, established precedents for African participation in international relations that would influence the development of Pan-African movements and anti-colonial
Organizations. As you consider Menelik's
extraordinary achievement in maintaining Ethiopian independence during the period of Europe's greatest colonial expansion, the question arises of whether his success represented a unique historical circumstance or evidence of possibilities for African resistance that might have been more widely available had African societies enjoyed access to the resources and diplomatic relationships that enabled Ethiopian defiance. The emperor who defied them all demonstrated that European assumptions about African backwardness and European superiority could be successfully challenged. Yet the extraordinary circumstances required for such challenges suggested that most African societies faced European expansion with far more limited possibilities for effective resistance. The uninvited ruler who asserted African sovereignty in the face of European dismissal established precedents for African agency that would influence the continent's struggle for independence, even while revealing the systemic advantages that European colonial powers enjoyed throughout the period of their greatest expansion. The correspondence that flowed between the imperial court in Addis Ababa and European capitals during the decade following Menelik's victory at Adwa revealed a sophisticated understanding of international relations that directly contradicted European assumptions about African political capability, as the emperor and his advisors demonstrated. Their ability to manipulate European rivalries while maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty through diplomatic methods whose subtlety matched anything available to European statesmen of the period. The treaties that Ethiopia negotiated with various European powers during this period, the correspondence that flowed between the imperial court in Addis Ababa and European capitals during the decade following Menelik's victory at Adwa revealed a sophisticated understanding of international relations that directly contradicted European assumptions about African political capability, as the emperor and his advisors demonstrated. Their ability to manipulate European rivalries while maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty through diplomatic methods whose subtlety matched anything available to European statesmen of the period. The treaties that Ethiopia negotiated with various European powers during this period reflected not just military strength but diplomatic sophistication that revealed the extent to which African rulers could master European diplomatic practices while preserving their own political traditions and national interests. The trade agreements that Menelik negotiated with Italian commercial interests following the military victory at Adwa demonstrated his understanding that diplomatic recognition required not just military capability but economic relationships that served European commercial needs while preserving Ethiopian control over crucial aspects of national development. The concessions that Ethiopian authorities granted to Italian companies for railway construction, though presented as evidence of Ethiopian openness to foreign investment, included provisions that maintained Ethiopian sovereignty over strategic infrastructure, while providing European investors with opportunities for profit that satisfied their commercial ambitions without compromising Ethiopian independence. These arrangements, though less lucrative for European companies than the unrestricted access they might have preferred, established precedents for economic relationships between African and European states that served mutual interests rather than exclusively European needs. The diplomatic missions that Menelik dispatched to European capitals during the 1890s revealed the extent to which Ethiopian authorities had mastered European diplomatic protocols while maintaining distinctly African approaches to international relations that emphasized reciprocal respect
rather than European superiority.
The embassy that arrived in Rome in 1897, led by Ras Makonnen with a retinue that included scholars, merchants and military advisors, conducted negotiations that established commercial relationships while asserting Ethiopian equality through diplomatic methods that combined European ceremonial practices with African concepts of hospitality and mutual obligation. The gifts that Ethiopian diplomats presented to European monarchs, which included not just traditional African artifacts, but examples of Ethiopian literary and artistic achievements, demonstrated African cultural sophistication while challenging European assumptions about African primitiveness that had underpinned colonial expansion. The military agreements that Ethiopia negotiated with various European powers during this period reflected Menelik's understanding that maintaining independence required access to European military technology while avoiding the kind of dependency relationships that might compromise Ethiopian sovereignty. The weapons purchases that Ethiopian agents arranged through European arms dealers, though conducted through commercial relationships rather than formal military alliances, provided Ethiopian forces with capabilities that matched those available to European colonial armies while maintaining Ethiopian control over military strategy and deployment. These arrangements, which required sophisticated understanding of European arms markets and military technology, demonstrated African capacity for mastering European technical knowledge while preserving indigenous military traditions that provided tactical advantages in conflicts fought on African terrain. The cultural exchanges that Menelik promoted with European institutions during the early 20th century revealed his recognition that diplomatic recognition required not just military and economic relationships, but intellectual engagement that demonstrated African capacity for participating in European-dominated discussions about science, technology, and international affairs. The Ethiopian scholars who studied in European universities during this period, though few in number compared to the European presence in Africa, returned to Ethiopia with knowledge that strengthened indigenous institutions while providing evidence of African intellectual capability that contradicted European assumptions about African backwardness. The European scholars and technicians who received permission to work in Ethiopia, though subject to restrictions that protected Ethiopian sovereignty, contributed to modernization efforts that demonstrated African capacity for selective adoption of European practices without
abandoning indigenous traditions, the legal frameworks
that governed Ethiopian relationships with European powers during this period demonstrated Menelik's understanding that international recognition required acceptance of European concepts of international
law while adapting such concepts to serve African rather than
exclusively European interests. The treaty negotiations that established Ethiopian boundaries with Italian colonies in Eritrea and British territories in the Sudan employed European legal, language and diplomatic protocols while asserting African sovereignty in ways that created precedents for international relationships that recognized mutual rights and obligations,
rather than European superiority.
These agreements, though based on European legal principles, established African participation in international
legal systems that had previously excluded
non-European states from equal membership. The question that emerges from this examination of Menelik's diplomatic achievements concerns not just the specific methods that enabled Ethiopian success, but the broader implications for understanding African agency during the colonial period, as the diplomatic sophistication demonstrated by Ethiopian authorities revealed possibilities for African participation in international relations that European colonial expansion had largely suppressed. The art of African diplomacy that Menelik practiced, while requiring extraordinary resources and circumstances that were not available to most African societies facing European expansion, demonstrated that African rulers possessed the capacity to master European diplomatic methods while preserving indigenous political traditions and national interests. The international recognition that Ethiopia eventually achieved, though based primarily on military victory rather than diplomatic acceptance of African equality, established precedents for African participation in global political systems that would influence anti-colonial movements throughout the colonial period. The dawn that broke over the Ethiopian highlands on the morning of October 27, 1909, carried with it the kind of crisp clarity that seemed to illuminate not just the physical
landscape of Africa's oldest independent state, but the
extraordinary historical achievement that Ethiopian sovereignty represented during an era when European colonial powers controlled more than 90% of the African continent. The death of Emperor Menelik II, which occurred in the royal palace that overlooked the capital city, whose modern development he had supervised,
marked the end of a reign that had
demonstrated the possibility of African resistance to European colonial expansion while establishing precedents for international recognition of African sovereignty that would influence the continent's
struggle for independence throughout the 20th century.
The mourning that followed his death extended far beyond the borders of the empire he had ruled, as African nationalists throughout the colonial world recognized that Ethiopian independence represented not just the survival of one African state, but evidence that European colonialism could be successfully challenged by African peoples who possessed the unity, resources, and determination necessary to defend their sovereignty. The immediate consequences of Menelik's death revealed the extent to which his achievement in maintaining Ethiopian independence had required not just military victory at Adwa, but the creation of administrative and diplomatic systems that could sustain African sovereignty in the face of continued European pressure for colonial expansion. the succession arrangements that transferred power to Empress Zewde while maintaining the governmental structures that Menelik had developed demonstrated the extent to which Ethiopian independence had become institutionalized rather than depending solely on individual leadership, though the challenges that the new government faced in maintaining international recognition revealed the ongoing vulnerability of African sovereignty during an era when European powers continued to view colonial expansion as natural and legitimate. The stability that Ethiopia maintained during this transition, though facilitated by the diplomatic relationships and administrative systems that Menelik had established, also reflected the broader African commitment to preserving the precedents for independence that Ethiopian defiance had created. The international response to Menelik's death revealed the extent to which his achievement in maintaining Ethiopian independence had influenced European understanding of African political capability as the diplomatic recognition that European powers extended to the new Ethiopian government reflected their acceptance of African sovereignty when backed by demonstrated military capability and sophisticated diplomatic practice. The embassies that European governments maintained in Addis Ababa, though serving primarily European commercial and strategic interests, also provided evidence of African participation in international diplomatic systems that had previously excluded non-European states from equal membership. The commercial relationships that European companies maintained with Ethiopian merchants and government officials, though conducted on terms that generally favored European interests, established precedents for economic relationships between African and European states that served mutual interests rather than exclusively colonial needs. The influence that Ethiopian independence exerted on African anti-colonial movements during the early 20th century extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic recognition that Ethiopia received from European powers, as African nationalists throughout the colonial world drew inspiration from the Ethiopian example while developing their own strategies for challenging European colonial rule. The connections that African American intellectuals maintained with Ethiopian diplomats and religious leaders, which included financial support for Ethiopian development projects and advocacy for international recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty, created transnational networks that linked African independence struggles with global movements for racial equality and anti-colonial resistance. The Pan-African conferences that brought together African and African American leaders during the 1920s and 1930s, though focused primarily on challenging colonial rule throughout Africa, consistently referenced Ethiopian independence as evidence that European colonialism could be successfully opposed through coordinated African resistance. The religious significance that Ethiopian independence held for African diaspora communities throughout the world reflected the extent to which the Ethiopian state represented not just political sovereignty but spiritual authority rooted in biblical traditions that connected African identity with divine purpose and historical destiny. The Rastafarian movement that emerged in Jamaica during the 1930s, though developing theological doctrines that extended far beyond Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, drew inspiration from the Ethiopian example while creating religious frameworks that linked African liberation with spiritual redemption. The African American churches that maintained interest in Ethiopian religious and political developments, though serving primarily local communities facing their own struggles against racial discrimination, used the Ethiopian example to demonstrate African capacity for self-government and cultural achievement that contradicted European assumptions about African inferiority. The military legacy of Ethiopian resistance to Italian colonial expansion established precedents for African armed resistance to European colonialism that would influence anti-colonial movements throughout Africa, as the tactical methods and organizational approaches that Ethiopian forces employed at Adwa provided models for African military leaders seeking to challenge European colonial armies whose technological superiority seemed to guarantee their dominance over African territories. The coordination of infantry and cavalry forces that Ethiopian commanders achieved, though based on indigenous military traditions rather than European military science, demonstrated African capacity for tactical innovation and strategic planning that contradicted European assumptions about African military backwardness. The logistic systems that Ethiopian forces developed, which enabled them to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods while operating far from their home bases, revealed African organizational capabilities that European colonial administrators often underestimated when assessing the challenges involved in conquering African territories. The diplomatic legacy of Menelik's success in maintaining Ethiopian independence extended throughout the colonial period as African leaders who challenged European colonial rule employed diplomatic methods that Ethiopian rulers had developed for managing relationships with European powers while preserving African sovereignty. The commercial treaties that anti-colonial leaders negotiated with European companies, though conducted under circumstances that generally favored European interests, employed legal frameworks and diplomatic protocols that Ethiopian diplomats had pioneered for maintaining African participation in international trade while limiting European political influence. The diplomatic missions that African nationalist leaders dispatched to European capitals during the independence struggles of the 1950s and 1960s, though focused primarily on achieving political independence rather than maintaining sovereignty, used diplomatic methods that Ethiopian representatives had employed for decades while seeking international recognition of African rights to self-determination. The boundaries that Ethiopia maintained throughout the colonial period, though established through negotiations with European powers that generally favored European interests, provided African nationalists with evidence that African states could maintain internationally recognized borders while preserving sovereignty over territories that European powers had sought to incorporate into their colonial empires. The territorial integrity that Ethiopia defended through diplomatic negotiation and military resistance, though requiring resources and circumstances that were not available to most African societies facing colonial expansion, established precedents for African border maintenance that would influence the development of the Organization of African Unity and its commitment to preserving colonial boundaries following independence. The international recognition that Ethiopia eventually received for its territorial claims, though based primarily on military victory rather than diplomatic acceptance of African equality, demonstrated that African states could achieve international legitimacy for boundaries that Africans had helped define rather than accepting borders imposed exclusively through European negotiation. The question that emerges from this examination of Menelik's legacy concerns not just the specific achievements that enabled Ethiopian independence, but the broader implications for understanding African possibilities during the colonial period, as the success that Ethiopia achieved in maintaining sovereignty revealed both the extraordinary requirements for African resistance to European expansion and the possibilities for African agency that colonial rule largely suppressed. The defiance that Menelik embodied, though requiring military, diplomatic, and administrative resources that most African societies could not access, demonstrated that European colonialism represented not inevitable African subjugation, but contested relationships whose outcomes could be influenced by African choices and capabilities. The international recognition that Ethiopia eventually achieved, though based primarily on European acceptance of Ethiopian military capability, rather than genuine acknowledgement of African equality, established precedents for African participation in global political systems that would influence the continent's
struggle for independence throughout the 20th century. The endurance of Ethiopian
independence throughout the colonial period, though requiring continuous diplomatic and military efforts that consumed resources that might otherwise have supported economic development, provided African peoples with evidence that European colonial rule represented not permanent subjugation, but temporary arrangements that could be successfully challenged through coordinated African resistance. The emperor, who had defied them all, established not just the survival of one African state, but the precedent for African sovereignty that would inspire
anti-colonial movements throughout the continent while demonstrating the kinds of
capabilities and commitments that African independence required. The legacy of defiance that Menelik embodied extended far beyond the specific territories that comprised the Ethiopian Empire, influencing African understanding of sovereignty, resistance, and international participation in ways that would shape the continent's political development throughout the independence era and beyond.